The smell came first. Burned flesh cooking under the July sun, blood drying in the dirt, and the stink of bodies left to rot. Flies swarmed over piles of the dead. The streets of Jerusalem, once sacred, were now soaked in death. You've heard the stories. Brave knights, holy missions, forget them. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders broke through the walls. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Men, women, children, no one was spared, no one was forgiven, no one was safe. This wasn't about faith, it was about power, about punishment. And it didn't end with killing. The Crusaders didn't just take Jerusalem, they broke it, they burned it, and they made sure the world would remember how. This is what really happened after the Holy City fell. The sun rose red over Jerusalem on July 15, 1099, casting a bloody haze over the city's ancient stone. Outside the walls, thousands of Crusaders stirred to life, armor clinking, swords sharpened, banners snapping in the breeze. Sweat already ran down their backs beneath chainmail. The siege had dragged on for weeks. Food had grown scarce, water even scarcer. But now, this morning, was the end. Trumpets blared. Siege towers groaned forward on wooden wheels, pushed and pulled by exhausted, filthy men who had crossed half the known world for this. Archers lined the towers, unleashing volleys into the city. Fires broke out along the ramparts. Inside Jerusalem, panic was rising. Cries echoed down narrow alleys as defenders rushed to hold the breach. Godfrey of Bouillon's forces hit first from the north. A hail of arrows met them, but the Crusaders kept climbing. One tower burst into flames, but still they pushed upward, hauling themselves over the battlements. The fighting was savage. Swords clashed, bodies tumbled from the walls, screams pierced the smoky air. Then came the break. Godfrey's men poured over the walls, and the defence collapsed. The southern gate fell soon after, hammered open by Raymond of Toulouse's troops. Now the Crusaders were inside. Jerusalem's fall had begun. Inside the city, chaos erupted. Families screamed through the streets, clutching what few possessions they could. Women grabbed children, dragging them toward mosques, churches, any place that might offer shelter. Old men stumbled through the dust. The rich tried to bribe their way to safety. The poor simply ran, but no one would be spared. The order was clear, no quarter. It meant no mercy, no negotiations. Kill everyone. The Crusaders surged forward like a flood. Steel clashed against flesh. Streets ran red. In some places the blood flowed so thick that it turned to mud underfoot. Door by door, house by house, the killing spread. Homes were kicked open. Entire families were cut down before they could speak. Some cried out to Jesus, others to Allah. It didn't matter. There would be no pause. In the Temple Mount, thousands gathered beneath the Dome of the Rock. Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, entire communities huddled in prayer, hoping the holiness of the space would protect them. Some kissed the stones, others clung to sacred texts. Then the Crusaders arrived. What followed was not battle, it was slaughter. Men were butchered as they prayed, children were run through with swords, women were dragged from corners and slain. The white marble turned slick with blood. Contemporary accounts claimed the killing was so intense that Crusaders waded through gore up to their ankles. The smell was unbearable: sweat, excrement, burned flesh, and blood baking in the summer heat. Elsewhere, Jews had barricaded themselves inside their synagogue, desperate for safety. The Crusaders set the building on fire. Trapped inside, entire families screamed as the flames consumed them. The attackers stood outside and listened. Across the city, surrender was met with slaughter. Civilians waved white cloths or dropped their weapons. It made no difference. Soldiers were drunk on fury and faith. A crying child, a begging priest, a bleeding mother, it didn't matter. This was vengeance. This was purification. At every turn, the Crusaders pressed deeper into the city, turning sacred places into killing grounds. Some fought back, hoping resistance might earn respect. It didn't. They were cut down where they stood or burned alive when their buildings were set ablaze. In alleyways, corpses piled up so fast they blocked passage. Flies swarmed, buzzing like static. Crusaders stepped over the dead and dying, kicking bodies aside to reach the next doorway. Blood dried in streaks across their faces. Hands trembled from exhaustion, not from guilt. Even animals were not spared. Horses too weak to carry riders were stabbed and left to twitch in the dust. Dogs were hacked down as they barked. The sound of death was everywhere. Metal splitting bone, fire crackling, voices breaking into screams, then silence. By nightfall the gates stood wide open, but no one fled. There was no point. Every alley was a trap. Every home had become a tomb. Jerusalem had been taken, not just conquered, but bled dry. Outside the city, the priests waited. As soldiers returned, some still wiping their blades, clergy offered blessings and communion. Psalms were read. Thanks were given. The killers knelt beside their weapons, faces stained with sweat and blood, and prayed. But the killing wasn't over, because for some, death was too easy. And the Crusaders still had more to prove. The gates had fallen, but Jerusalem's nightmare was only beginning. For 2 days and nights, the killing did not stop. It did not slow. It only deepened. Once the initial wave of slaughter swept through the main streets and religious sites, the Crusaders began their grim second act, systematic, house-by-house extermination. From mansions in the Jewish quarter to humble stone dwellings near the city's edge, no structure was spared. Iron-shod boots smashed down doors. Soldiers flooded into rooms, dragging people from hiding places, beneath beds, behind curtains, inside wells and cisterns. The first sword stroke rarely killed. Screams rang out again and again before silence finally took them. Entire families were butchered in their homes. In one quarter, men were stabbed in front of their wives, their heads hacked off and thrown into courtyards as trophies. Children were chased through cramped corridors, caught by the arms or hair, and cut down like lambs. Infants were tossed into the air and split with swords, their bodies left twitching in pools of blood. No command ordered such things. It was not strategy. It was fury, and it was allowed to bloom. Churches that had once offered sanctuary became death traps. In the Armenian and Greek Orthodox chapels, Jerusalem's Christians, deemed heretical by the Latin Crusaders, found no mercy. Some were slaughtered mid-prayer, their cries muffled by chants of psalms from their killers. Others were stripped, dragged into the streets, and executed in front of cheering soldiers. One bishop, according to later reports, was burned alive inside his cathedral after refusing to renounce his doctrine. Flies began to fill the air by the second day, thick black clouds drawn to the endless rot. The stench rolled down from the upper city. Smoke, blood, rotting meat, and feces, until even the Crusaders covered their noses. In the heat, bodies swelled and split open. Dogs began tearing limbs from corpses in the alleyways. The sound of buzzing wings became a near-constant hum, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the jeers of soldiers looting their victims. Eyewitnesses described doorways so packed with the dead that new bodies had to be heaped on top. Corpses lay 2 or 3 deep in some streets, crushed into the mud, faces frozen in terror or agony. Blood ran through the gutters like spring runoff, staining the stone red. The iron tang of it lingered in the throat. No one could eat without tasting it. And yet, amid the carnage, the Crusaders gave thanks. Priests marched through the streets, blessing the men who had killed, praising God for the victory. Some Crusaders wept openly as they prayed over severed limbs. Others sang hymns while standing ankle-deep in gore. There was no contradiction in their minds. This was righteousness. This was holy work. Some even stripped naked and bathed in the Temple Mount's bloodied fountains, laughing as they splashed each other like children. Elsewhere, the killing took new forms. Jews who had survived the burning synagogue were dragged into public squares and executed one by one. Survivors were sometimes forced to gather the bodies of their loved ones before being killed themselves. One chronicler described how Crusaders set a pile of sacred Torah scrolls ablaze, then hurled living captives onto the flames. Muslims who had taken refuge in mosques fared no better. Dozens of imams were beheaded before their congregations. Others were bound and made to watch as their followers were flayed or mutilated before them. One commander reportedly nailed a Quran to a cross and paraded it through the streets, laughing as prisoners were forced to bow before it. Priests stood at the edges of these scenes, offering last rites to the dying if they converted. Some did, out of terror. Others spat and were cut down where they knelt. The city's air became so choked with ash and death that even the Crusaders began to falter. Some vomited as they passed piles of the dead. A few broke ranks and collapsed weeping beside the bodies of women and children. But most pushed forward, blind with righteousness or too far gone in the madness to stop. By the third night, torches flickered across the rooftops as fires burned uncontrolled, smoke curling over the city like a funeral shroud. And still, not everyone was dead. In the shadows of Jerusalem's ruined homes, in deep cellars and dry wells, survivors waited. They heard every scream, every laugh, every footstep. Some bit into their own arms to stop from crying out. Others whispered prayers they knew would go unanswered. They had seen what happened to those who begged. They had heard the Crusaders laugh as they killed. For these few who still clung to life, the sword was no longer the worst fate. The next chapter of the conquest would not be swift. It would not be merciful. It would be slow and made for an audience. By the fourth day, the frenzy of killing had slowed, but only because there were fewer people left to kill. What began as a campaign of conquest had morphed into something colder, quieter, and more deliberate. The Crusaders no longer moved in frenzied mobs. They began to select, to savour. Jerusalem was no longer a battlefield, it had become a theatre. From dark cellars and half-collapsed ruins, survivors were dragged out one by one. They were bound with ropes or chains and paraded through the streets. Bloodied, barefoot, and sunburned, they were led like cattle beneath the sweltering sky. Children too small to walk were thrown over shoulders. The older ones were whipped if they slowed. Every march ended in a public square or near a ruined shrine, where soldiers and onlookers had already gathered. This was not execution. This was spectacle. Some captives were forced to kneel and recite their faith while surrounded by jeering knights. Then came the blades. Heads were taken clean, or not clean, the dull edge of a sword hacking again and again while blood fountained across the stones. In some cases, the soldiers took turns, passing the blade from one man to the next as if in ritual. Laughter mingled with prayers. Each new execution drew cheers. Others suffered longer. Men were tied to posts with their hands behind their backs. There they were cut not fatally but purposefully. Noses sliced off, ears hacked away, lips removed. Some were left alive like that, stumbling in shock, their faces grotesquely altered, their screams barely human. One boy, no older than 10, had his fingers taken one at a time while his father watched, weeping and begging. When the boy stopped crying, they took the father's tongue. No orders demanded these acts. There were no commands passed down from papal envoys or noble lords, but neither were they stopped. The commanders knew what was happening. They walked past it. Some even watched. In one case, a group of captured guards, strong, healthy men, were stripped, shackled, and made to run circles in a square as Crusaders threw stones and laughed. Each man who collapsed was beaten with the flat of a sword until he stood again. Eventually, all were beheaded. One knight cleaned his blade on a banner ripped from the dome of the rock, but cruelty wasn't only for men. Women fared no better. Some were bound and forced to dance for their captors under threat of death. Others were stripped and marched through the city, jeered at by soldiers and looters alike. One group of women was forced to carry the severed heads of their husbands in baskets, paraded before a mocking crowd. When one woman collapsed in grief, her head was added to the pile. A few of the noble women were kept alive, but not spared. In some cases, they were forced to serve as handmaids to Crusader officers, made to clean weapons still stained with their own kin's blood. One Muslim noblewoman was made to carry chamber pots for a French commander, while wearing a tiara of thorns he crafted himself. When she dropped one, she was whipped until she bled through her robes. But perhaps the most chilling acts were the ones performed for an audience. Soldiers gathered captives, especially those of rank or religious standing, and staged mock trials. Imams and rabbis were dragged into circles and accused of blasphemy, then forced to debate with Crusader priests. No one survived these trials. Those who refused to speak were tortured. Those who answered were killed. One rabbi, when asked to explain why God had not protected his people, replied simply, "Because you have made him leave." They cut his throat while the crowd clapped. Each day brought a new performance. New torments, executions at sunrise, mutilations at noon, mock sermons in the afternoon. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the Crusaders lit torches and continued by firelight. Some played dice for who would deliver the killing blow. Others made games of precision, seeing who could strike the same spot twice in a row. The blood never dried before new blood covered it. And still, some were spared. Not out of mercy, but for something worse. A few prisoners were kept alive. not for labor or ransom, but for humiliation. These were often the most devout religious leaders, respected elders, scholars. The Crusaders broke them slowly. One imam was forced to trample a Quran, then kiss a crucifix while crowds chanted. A Jewish scribe was made to sing a Christian hymn in Hebrew before they beat him with his own scrolls. Some prisoners were tattooed or branded with Christian symbols, then paraded as trophies. By now, the city reeked of fire, sweat, and decay. The screams had become part of the background noise, like the hum of flies. The horror was no longer loud, it had settled into something far worse routine. But the Crusaders weren't done yet. They had shed blood, broken bodies, and shattered souls. Now, they would take Jerusalem's memory, its identity, its faith. They would turn the holy city into a monument to their power, a mark on the world that would never be washed away. By the end of the first week, the killing slowed, not because mercy had returned, but because there were fewer throats left to cut. The Crusaders turned their attention from death to dominance, from erasing lives to erasing identities. It was no longer enough to conquer Jerusalem. The city had to be reshaped. Its people had to be broken, not just in body, but in belief. It began with baptisms. Captives young and old, Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian, were marched to the remaining wells, fountains, or open cisterns. There, soldiers held them down, one by one, and poured water over their heads while priests chanted in Latin. Some captives resisted, thrashing, spitting, screaming until their mouths filled with water. They were pulled aside and killed on the spot. Others went limp and allowed it to happen, hoping that submission might buy survival. It often didn't. But for the Crusaders, that didn't matter. The ritual wasn't about saving souls. It was about power, about declaring victory over both body and spirit. In some cases, entire families were baptized at sword point, children torn from mothers' arms and doused while they wept. Converted captives were paraded through the streets as trophies, their clothes soaked, their eyes empty. Religious leaders were targeted with particular malice. Rabbis and imams were dragged into public squares and ordered to recant their faiths. Some were forced to stomp on their own holy texts or kiss crucifixes while crowds watched. Refusal meant immediate death. Compliance meant being branded as a traitor to one's own people, and even then, death often followed only slower. One rabbi was made to dance barefoot across hot coals while soldiers mocked his chants of scripture. When he fell, they carried him on a stretcher to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and tossed his charred body onto the steps. An imam was stripped, blindfolded, and brought before a crowd where he was made to recite the Lord's Prayer in Arabic. When he faltered, they broke his fingers one by one until he finished. Those who had once ruled the city were brought low in other ways. Nobles, men and women alike, were stripped of their robes and forced into menial labour. Once proud commanders of Jerusalem's defence now hauled water for their conquerors or dug graves for the victims they could not protect. Their jewellery was torn away, their hair hacked off with dull blades. Some were made to clean the very weapons used to slaughter their people. The humiliation was always public, always calculated. A priest tied a captured scholar to a post and made him read from a Latin translation of a Christian psalm, mispronouncing every word while Crusaders roared with laughter. When he finished, they beat him for his errors, then made him do it again. Women suffered in quieter ways, but not lesser ones. Some were forced to serve as maids in Crusader camps, scrubbing armour, cleaning blood from floors, fetching wine with trembling hands. Others were made to sing hymns they didn't understand or attend masses held in ruined mosques. One girl, no more than 15, was made to wear a nun's habit sewn from rags and lead a prayer procession through the Jewish quarter, her own neighbourhood, now emptied of life. For many, death would have been kinder. But the Crusaders knew that. They weren't simply punishing bodies, they were extinguishing culture, dignity, and memory. They wanted the survivors to live with the loss, to wear it, to carry it forward as proof that their gods, their families, and their city had all failed them. By mid-July, Jerusalem no longer resembled the holy mosaic it once had. Minarets had been torn down, synagogues blackened by fire. The walls were covered in graffiti scrawled in Latin, Deus vult, Christus vincit, non credentes mortui. Corpses had been cleared from the streets, but the smell of decay lingered, soaked into stone and soil. And amid it all, survivors moved like shadows, silent, blank-eyed and broken. They obeyed, they prayed when told, they bowed when ordered, they smiled when watched. And inside, something colder than hate began to grow. Because the Crusaders believed the city was theirs, that they had remade it. But Jerusalem had a long memory, and the scars they carved into its streets and its people would never fade. When the killing and conversion slowed, the Crusaders turned to the last act of conquest: possession. They had taken the lives of Jerusalem's defenders, and they had bent the survivors under their will. Now they would strip the holy city itself, its stone, its treasures, its spirit, until nothing of its former self remained. Looting began almost before the bodies cooled. Crusaders moved through the streets in organized bands, some under orders from their lords, others simply following the smell of wealth. They pried gold bangles from stiff wrists and wrenched rings from fingers, severing them if the flesh had swollen. Earrings were ripped from ears still warm. Robes of silk and fine cotton were pulled from corpses and slung over armor, the stains of blood treated as no offense. The plunder spread into sacred spaces. Churches that had once served Eastern Christian communities were ransacked for chalices, altar cloths, and relics. The ancient Church of the Holy Sepulchre was spared destruction but not theft. Its treasures were stripped away, carried off in saddlebags destined for faraway castles. Priests loyal to Rome claimed the holiest artifacts as rightful spoils, marking them with wax seals to ensure they were delivered to the Vatican or to the private chapels of their patrons. Mosques became targets of deliberate desecration. In the Great Al-Aqsa Mosque, Crusaders stabled their horses, spreading hay over marble floors once used for prayer. The smell of manure and sweat filled the sacred hall, mixing with the stench of blood from those who had been slaughtered there days earlier. Crusaders carved crosses into the columns, spat on the walls, and dragged survivors inside to clean the filth under the watch of armed guards. Synagogues, already gutted by fire, were picked over for whatever could still be sold or melted. The charred remains of Torah scrolls were scattered underfoot, their inked letters smudged into the dirt. Even the nails and hinges from the burned doors were pried loose, bundled, and traded among soldiers as materials for weapons and armor. In some places, desecration was not merely opportunistic, it was ceremonial. Crusaders would gather in a plundered shrine, raise goblets of stolen wine, and toast to their victory while seated on overturned altars. In one particularly grotesque display, a group of knights held a feast inside the Dome of the Rock, laying their food directly on the central stone revered by three faiths. They ate and drank until they could barely stand, then relieved themselves in the corners before leaving. No treasure was too small to be taken. Brass candlesticks, silver belt buckles, embroidered cushions, all were piled into carts. Even the copper plumbing from fountains was dismantled, the basins left dry and cracked under the sun. Crusaders stripped the city like wolves tearing at a carcass, leaving bare walls where once there had been colour, music, and prayer. Jerusalem's relics were the most prized. Anything claimed to be touched by Christ, carried by the apostles, or belonging to the prophets, was seized. Many of these items were genuine, others were forged on the spot, sold to eager knights for fortunes in gold. A sliver of wood said to be from the true cross was paraded through the streets before being locked away in a jewelled case. Smaller relics disappeared entirely, passed from hand to hand until they surfaced years later in European cathedrals. Meanwhile, the city's very fabric was being altered. Buildings damaged in the siege were demolished, their stones used to expand Crusader fortifications or rebuild in their own style. Markets once bustling with Arabic, Greek and Hebrew voices now echoed with French and Latin. The call to prayer was gone, replaced by church bells tolling from towers hastily erected from scavenged stone. In the eyes of the Crusaders, this was purification. To them, Jerusalem had been tainted by centuries under Muslim control, polluted by the presence of non-believers. Erasing that past was not vandalism, it was divine duty. Every mosque turned into a church, every burnt synagogue left in ruins, every holy relic rebranded as Christian property, was a step towards sanctifying their conquest. For the survivors, it was an unending grief. They watched their sacred spaces turned into mockeries, their treasures carted away to foreign lands. Some were forced to assist in the desecration, hauling rubble from demolished minarets, scrubbing blood from floors before horses were led in, or carrying loads of stolen goods to the Crusaders' storage yards. The humiliation was sharper than the hunger that gnawed at their bellies. By late summer, Jerusalem's transformation was nearly complete. The Crusaders had remade it into a city that reflected only their faith, their symbols, and their power. But beneath the fresh coats of whitewash, under the crosses carved into stone, the marks of what they had destroyed remained. The cracks in the marble, the smoke stains on the walls, the faint ghost of calligraphy beneath layers of plaster all whispered of what had been taken. For now, the Crusaders celebrated. Their treasure chests were full, their banners hung from every high place, and their clergy blessed the city as if it had been born anew. But outside Jerusalem, the news was spreading news of the slaughter, the desecration, the theft. And beyond the horizon, in cities still free, men began to vow that one day the holy city would be taken back. The Crusaders had secured their prize. But they had also sown the seeds of a reckoning. Word of Jerusalem's fall spread quickly, carried by pilgrims, merchants, and envoys. In Aleppo, Damascus, and Cairo, stories of the slaughter turned to vows of revenge. The details shifted in the retelling ankle-deep blood, sacred places defiled, children cut down, but the message was constant. The Christians had come not to liberate but to annihilate. The massacre forged unity among rival Muslim rulers. Preachers in great mosques declared that reclaiming the holy city was a sacred duty. Poets mourned it in verse. Mothers swore their sons to its liberation. Within a generation, leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and Saladin would rise with the memory of 1099 as their rallying cry. In Europe, the same events were celebrated. Chroniclers called the conquest a miracle. Knights were praised for purifying the city. Relics stripped from its shrines appeared in cathedrals, displayed as proof of divine favour. The rivers of blood that horrified the East became, in the West, a badge of honour. This split in memory ensured the Crusades would not end with Jerusalem's capture. Each side carried the story like a wound or a banner. For the Crusaders, it was evidence of their righteousness. For the Muslims, proof of their enemies' cruelty. War was now not only about land, but about vengeance, sanctified by faith. Jerusalem itself bore the scars. Stones still blackened from fire, courtyards where families had been slaughtered, markets emptied of their native voices, every street carried a memory. Survivors lived as shadows among the ruins, reminders that conquest had not brought peace, only silence. Muslim chroniclers recorded the events in stark detail, ensuring the memory would outlive those who had seen it. For centuries, the massacre of 1099 would be invoked as both a warning and a call to arms. The Crusaders had tried to erase the city's past, but instead they had etched it into the world's memory. In July of that year, as Crusader banners flew over Jerusalem's walls, the victors believed their triumph eternal. They could not hear the whispers beyond the horizon, the promises made in distant cities, the oaths sworn over the graves of the dead. The holy city had been taken, but it was already calling for its avengers.